There was another book that I should have brought. There may have been a subconscious reason why I didn't, because it's huge and heavy. It's called The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, the last book written by Stephen Jay Gould. Now, Gould is famous as a scientist and as an atheist. He died about a couple of years ago. But what not everybody knows is that Gould wrote a book called The Rocks of Ages, plural. Not the Rock of Ages, The Rocks of Ages. And it was a book that rather scandalised a friend very close to Jill and myself, who was a great scientist who had 2 PhDs in science, been principal of a Christian college, and was deeply respected by all who knew him. But in a time of great stress, his faith had faltered. But it always bothered him that Stephen Jay Gould wrote the book The Rocks of Ages. Well, what did Gould say? He said, "I have many friends among scientists who are believers, and I have come to the position that it is not for us who are atheists and who are scientists to criticise our fellow scientists who are Christians and believers." He said, "I believe there's room for both." So that was a book that scandalised many atheist scientists, The Rocks of Ages. But the book I wanted to bring today, about that size, really, I'm not exaggerating, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, the main thing it says is that the Darwinian teaching of evolution by very gradual change is not tenable. Now, Gould was an evolutionist. He and Niles Eldredge invented what was known as punctuated equilibrium, which, not in harmony with his purpose, but served the purpose of advertising to the world how many blank spaces there were in the geological column where Darwin thought there would be transitional species. You've heard the expression missing link. Not one, millions. Darwin's word, infinitude. Another word of Darwin, myriads. I have Darwin's Origin of Species. It's easy to read. He was a very good writer. He was a very good man, a good husband, good father, but way astray in the main thing for which he's known. But the main point in this most recent tome, huge book, The Structure of Evolutionary Theory by Stephen Jay Gould, is that the main thesis of Charles Darwin was wrong. Now again, I remind you, he was an evolutionist, but he did not believe in Darwinism. Darwin was his hero for branching out in something new, but he couldn't accept Darwin's explanation for the arrival of species. Why is that interesting? Because most scientists in the world for decades have held the opposite position. Most scientists for decades have been Darwinians. I venture to say, if time should last another 2 decades, they will be as rare as hen's teeth. Darwin had a chapter, The Imperfections of the Geological Record. That was the excuse he gave why they didn't find missing links. Not just the link before mankind, between all the kinds. So he wrote this chapter, very readable, The Imperfections of the Geological Record. But the record's no longer imperfect. They now have a complete geological record. From the very first things with life, with very few cells, through the ages, up to man. It's not imperfect, and there are no missing links. For this reason, many Christians now believe in what they call progressive creation. I'm not a scientist. I take no sides. I read, I think, but you have to be a scientist to be very dogmatic on some of these issues. But many Christians have become progressive creationists because of what Eldridge and Gould found out after much research shared in by many others. And you have to be careful with ontologists, anthropologists. There are several names for them. They are said to have the biggest ego of anyone on the planet. Because the great search by anthropologists is to discover something so many millions of years old, and they'll become famous, maybe they'll be named after it. But they cannot agree. And until recently, they were all Darwinians. Now, it's also not known that the hominids, human-like creatures, Pekin man, Nebraska man, Lucy, Australopithecines, their alliance with mankind has also been defused. Lucy could not walk properly. They thought she was a miniature woman. It wasn't so. So there are many publications now explaining that all the so-called missing links before man are not. But I wanted you to know that the most famous book written by Stephen Jay Gould is a denial of the type of evolution that was believed in by scientists for many decades. Stephen Jay Gould. He was also the man that said the human brain was the result of 50 billion coincidences. And you've heard me say that he reminds me of the person who said if the Bible said Jonah swallowed the whale, he'd believe it. 50 billion coincidences? Let me quote Darwin. I've been reading Darwin's autobiography. Very interesting. When he's a little boy and he's running home and afraid he'd be late, he'd pray to God for help. He trained to be a minister, you know. When he set out on his voyage in the Beagle around the world, took 5 years, with a captain who was a bit double-barrelled, later suicided. He was an evangelical Christian. But when he would tell the sailors on board, you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that because the Bible says, they laughed at him. When he came across the finches of the Galapagos Islands that were obviously of a kind and yet different, he said God wouldn't have made 12 different species for these little outjuttings of rock in the Great Sea, so they must have been changed by nature. And today, everybody who reads believes in microevolution, that there can be a variety of species of the one kind. That's never been the issue. The issue is macroevolution. Can a whale come from a land mammal? That's macroevolution. That's a different kettle of fish. Anyway, I want to quote you from Darwin. Darwin said, "Can the human brain be trusted? A brain which I believe came from a brain the size of that possessed by the lowest animals. Can it be trusted when it comes to such grand conclusions, evolution?" That's a good question, wasn't it? If, as Gould says, the brain is the result of 50 billion coincidences, why trust it? Why trust it? I think that Denton is right when he said, trial and error, chance only ever yield trivial results. They talk about monkeys with typewriters, given enough time, would come up with Shakespeare. Don't ever believe it. To come up with one sonnet of Shakespeare, they estimate would take 10 to 690th. Now that doesn't mean anything till you remember all the grains of sand on the seashore amount to 10 to 25. And all the atoms of the universe amount to 10 to 80. You know, 10 multiplied by itself 80 times, see? So to get a sonnet of Shakespeare would take 10 to the 609. Other words, it can't be done. Cannot be done. Anyway, that's my apology for not bringing Stephen J. Gould. Back to John 8. Gould is a great writer. His style is very taking. The only thing wrong is his conclusions.